We are now having our round table. I would like to present very quickly, but I think many of you already know our speakers. So Paul Moore from Ireland, and he's a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist, and he was the chair of the Irish Institute for Psychotherapy, and he teaches at the Trinity College in Dublin. Then we have Francesco Castellet, who is from Rome, and he's full member of the Italian Psychoanalytic Society, and he's a neurologist and a psychiatrist. And then we have Iris Raveh, very difficult name. And Iris is senior psychoanalyst and psychotherapist, and she works in Israeli. Yes, she's organizer of the Israeli Neuropsychoanalytic Society. So I would like to start with Paul. He will have 15 minutes, Paul, okay, for your presentation. Then it will be followed by Francesco, then by Iris, and then finally there will be a discussion among the presenters and Bill. And then there will be discussion with the audience. So if you have questions, please write them on the chat if you wish, or if not, remind them, and then you will ask directly. Okay, so Paul, please start.
Okay. I'll do my best, Claudia, to fit everything in and slowly and clearly in 15 minutes.
Yes.
I might go over a little bit. So can you see my slide?
Yes.
Okay. So firstly, thank you to the Italian Neuropsychoanalytic Society for inviting me here today, and to the Italian Psychoanalytic Dialogues Group for inviting me back to speak at this lecture series. And also thank you to Rosa for a really generous presentation and a really rich presentation. It was absolutely wonderful, Rosa. Thank you. Just a bit of background. I began my early psychology clinical work in the area of autism, and I worked behaviorally with children with autism prior to and during my psychoanalytic training. Even before my exposure to psychoanalytic ideas, I had noted the differing styles of relating between staff and children, and how this seemed to be a factor in the children's progress. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was already starting to think about and tuning into something about the importance of containment, relationships, and their connection to emotional regulation and development. I now no longer work with children, but I work with adults, and many of the people I work with are adults who would have received a diagnosis on the autism spectrum. I'm a big admirer of Bill's work in the field, and it's a real honor for me to be collaborating with him here today. And thank you, Bill, for your absolutely wonderful presentation. So in the short time I have, I'm going to say something about the history of autism in psychoanalysis, talk about the work of Ana Alvarez, and then say something about the relevance of neuropsychoanalysis to the understanding and treatment of persons with autism. But before I do that, I'd just like to say a word of acknowledgement and thanks to a mentor of mine, Professor Michael Fitzgerald, who supervised me and really gave me a very solid understanding and grounding in the theory and practice of working with people with autism. And Michael is an emeritus professor at the Department of Psychiatry in Trinity College. So much of the contemporary psychoanalytic psychotherapy carried out in the field of autism is conducted under the aegis of the Tavistock Clinic in London. Child psychoanalysts emerging from this tradition are steeped in the thinking of Melanie Klein, Wilfred Bion, Donald Winnicott, and more recently Francis Tustin, Donald Meltzer, and Anne Alvarez. So few people outside of the world of psychoanalysis are aware that in 1930, before Kanner had identified autism as a syndrome, Melanie Klein wrote about a 4-year-old boy she worked with named Dick, who held a remarkable similarity to Kanner's syndrome. And it is interesting to note that Klein was reluctant to diagnose Dick with childhood psychosis, preferring instead to think of it as an inhibition in development rather than a regression. She believed the condition to be of constitutional origin rather than psychogenic, going further still to posit that the child's abnormality in personal relations was intimately linked to his impaired capacity to symbolize. Klein recognized that an alternative psychoanalytic approach was required due to a deviation in the normal development of the child's fantasy life, and typical psychoanalytic approaches may fail due to this. Klein drew particular attention to the social, affective, cognitive, and motivational factors involved in autism, widely accepted today by experts in the field as the most serious impairments challenging individuals with autism. Donald Meltzer's work concerning children with autism centers on the notion of what he called mindlessness. This is where the child is unable to sensually integrate any meaningful perceptions or complex emotions. Meltzer believes that children with autism lack the capacity to experience people as beings who can help them to assimilate emotional experience. According to this account, children are also unable to establish an internal world successfully and are impaired in their capacities for symbolization and projective identification. Meltzer, like Klein, does not believe these deficits to be psychogenic in origin, suggesting instead that the child with autism's experience of other people is fundamentally abnormal, lacking both integration and depth. This is a factor which contributes to the defective object relations which are to be observed in autism. In collaboration with Esther Bick at the Tavistock Centre, Meltzer developed the notion of adhesive identification, which is a modification of Melanie Klein's projective identification, which is manifest as a form of narcissistic identification unique to autistic states. We see this in Rose's work with Jay, and the idea of a symbiotic psychosis is a similar concept. Frances Tustin, whose key contributions to the area of autism were her conceptualizing of the sensory world of the child with autism through the concept of adhesive identification. She identified two ways of being in children with autism. These were the encapsulated child and the entangled child. The former is akin to Kanner's notion of extreme aloneness, while the latter conforms more to the characteristic confusional states evident in schizophrenia. These categories are helpful in the understanding and management of learning impaired children. Another useful concept of Tustin's is the black hole experience, which represents for children with autism the ultimate trauma of bodily separateness from the mother. Tustin sees the trauma of nothingness and meaninglessness as the most terrifying of human experiences. It is this terror that instigates the creation of an alternative split-off world as a desperate defense against the black hole commonly seen in autism and psychosis. Tustin originally thought that development in autism had become fixed at a stage that is common in typical early development, which she labeled autosensuousness, a stage where the child cannot differentiate between their own body and that of the mother's. Anne Alvarez, thought by many to be the John Bowlby of working with difficult to reach children, for her psychoanalytically informed multidisciplinary approach to the theory and treatment of autistic, borderline, deprived and abused children. Alvarez advocates a tripartite approach, suggesting that any intervention must not only be psychoanalytically informed, but also developmentally informed and psychopathologically informed. In the sense that the normal bits of the personality may be very immature compared to the actual age of the child. Alvarez extends the term psychopathological knowledge to include therapists who are neuropsychoanalytically informed. For Alvarez, a knowledge of the neuroanatomy and neurophysiology is an integral part of the process of understanding children presenting with neurodevelopmental disorders, much like Bill's model. So with regards to Rose's case, Alvarez's idea of being developmentally informed is the sense that the normal bits of the personality may be very immature compared to the chronological age of the child. So you might need to picture it as though you're talking to a toddler, or as in Rose's J, a toddler bit of the child. And the psychopathologically informed piece is to get hold of the fact that this may no longer be a simple defense. It may have become compulsive and addictive. And there is actually a pleasant affective state associated with it. And I think Bill alludes to this when he talks about the survival aspect of the autistic shell. There's a pleasure in surviving and staying away from the much feared contact. So Alvarez also talks about reclamation in her work. So rolling up your sleeves, no room for blank slate analysts in this approach, and engaging the child or adult and meeting them at their level in an attempt to reclaim the psychical mindscape. Bill, in his work, talks about the Sunshine Program. This program seems to me to be a similar approach getting into the child's world, establishing a relationship on the patient's level, if you will. Alvarez also talks about the distinction between withdrawn and undrawn children. We can think about this in terms of Tustin, encapsulated and entangled ways of being. Alvarez advocates adopting a state of mind akin to the natural dual track mode of function of a mother, attending to and performing multiple tasks while holding her baby in her arms and mind. Reclamation is not unlike Christopher Bolas's approach to working with young psychotic people, where prior to deep psychoanalytic work, he engages in an ordinary level of conversation about recent events, for example, basketball games, etc., attempting to ground his patients in time and space, like Rosa did with Jay. A kind of amygdala, hippocampal stimulation, reactivation, leading to affect regulation. But more of this later. So if we note the difference between Rose's fresh approach and that of psychotherapist A, which is might be considered the classical blank slate analyst, my belief that this approach is traumatizing and damaging to children with autism, and arguably all patients. We can see in the wonderful work Rosa has done with Jay, she is trying to disrupt the addictive cycle and dismantle the rigidity and the complacency in her, and has quite a lot of success in the early encounter in helping Jay to be interested in the world outside the family again. I love the things Rosa did that were so open-hearted and opening, unfreezing of her patient's heart. That is, at the early stages when they wandered the earth together. And this brings up the issue of modification of classical psychoanalytic technique when working with this profile of patient. And probably the most crucial insight Alvarez has to offer, applicable to our adult neurotypical patients also, where it is important to know where our patients are in the session. That is, what level of pathology is operating now. As analysts, we are obliged to track our patients and follow them. This is elucidated beautifully in Ana Alvarez's paper, Levels of Pathology and Levels of Analytic Work. The following is an example of what relates to Rosa's case, and it put me in mind of how there might be ways of doing what Rosa did early on with Jay, imaginatively and creatively with our patients in the room. In a personal communication with Ana Alvarez, she once told me the story of one child with autism who had begun to like hide and seek, and she pretended that she was in her consulting room. She pretended she was hiding down the street in another building and described all the houses and buildings along the way, and he loved it. And another child where she pretended they were in a canoe going along a river looking for buried treasure in the banks of the river. And the kid absolutely loved this. So we can understand this as a kind of training the time and space traveling capacity of the children. Learning in a positively charged affective environment is very, very powerful. Activating what Jaak Panksepp called the play system and the seeking system. I'm not going to elaborate on this, as I'm sure Irith will most likely speak about it later. Okay, but it provides a nice segue nicely into the question about what might actually be going on here neuropsychologically for the child, and how might knowing something about this help us in treating these children and adults in our clinical practice. Obviously, autism is a whole system, whole brain issue, and Bill in his work emphasizes a few brain regions that are heavily implicated in symptoms associated with autism, such as the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, and the amygdala. I would like to focus on two, the amygdala and the hippocampus, as these two structures are heavily interdependent developmentally and have a feed-forward effect on the trajectory of the development of the entire cortex, and therefore the prefrontal cortex also. The amygdala is fully formed and functioning in the third trimester of pregnancy. It is responsible for the processing of emotional experience at an early stage in the organization of the brain, which means we are laying down very early emotional memories in utero. The formation and laying down of these affective memories is an independent and separate dissociable system and process in implicit memory. The hippocampus is a structure that neuroanatomically and neurodevelopmentally projects and grows out of the amygdala. It is only present at birth in a very rudimentary way and is not really up and running in any meaningful way until 18 months to 2 years of age. And even then, it is not operating in a very sophisticated way. It is the structure that performs the process of tagging experience for cognitive meaning. It allows us to form, in Freud's words, thing presentations and word presentations, roughly synonymous with Bion's alpha function. It allows us to generate mental images and maps, the mental solids that evolve in relation to our experiences with the outside world, and become the building blocks of our conscious thinking. The hippocampus is also heavily involved in temporal and spatial awareness and memory. It's also involved in a process that's known as episodic memory, where we construct an I, a sense of self, and we can relate that to other experiences and events in our lives. So this is quite relevant to Rose's work in reactivating the temporal and spatial experiences of Jay. The nature of the axis created between the amygdala and the hippocampus determines to a large extent the content and structure of the cortex. Postmortem studies indicate the presence of significant abnormalities in the neuronal tissue of the amygdalas of persons with autism. In the case of the typically functioning amygdala, experiences perceived as fearful may be capable of being regulated. This allows the infant to recover sufficiently from such experiences to establish a causal link via the hippocampus between separating from the mother, for example, experiencing anxiety, reuniting with the mother and that anxiety through the normal functioning of the amygdala. In the case of the infant with a hyperfunctional amygdala, which can happen for many reasons, as Bill has elucidated in his presentation, the initial anxiety levels may be so great as to inhibit any causal link being established, and therefore no template of separation and reunion is established or internalized. The latter scenario develops into escalating states of anxiety. This in turn leads to drastic defense measures being deployed, such as the massive projection of everything out of the self. This has the effect of freezing the infant developmentally. The end result is an infant terrified of interaction, for fear of separation, continuously attempting to mediate this terror through means of self-stimulatory gratification of the senses, such as the stereotypical motor actions present in autism. In an ongoing battle to allay the terror by dissipating the affect through the body, as opposed to being able to symbolize and contain it via hippocampal cortical pathways. This makes the environment of the child with impairments vitally important, which in turn highlights the importance of parent work with children with autism. Autism impacts the way parents relate to their children. It traumatizes them on a level. This is not parent blaming. Parents are very often traumatized by their children and are under great pressure from massive and intensive projective identification. A fully supported parent can help mitigate some of the effects of neurological amygdala hippocampal impairment and reactivate containment and reverie. Treating autism requires a whole system, holistic approach. My mentor, Professor Fitzgerald, often cited that autism needs a multidisciplinary approach. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for also linking the historical part to the recent neuropsychological aspects. So thank you very much. And there will be time for the discussion with what you said later with the discussion with the audience. And now, Francesco, please.
And yes, I was thanking the previous presenters and Rosa for the beautiful case. I'm sure it will stimulate a great discussion afterwards. And as in the previous presentation made with Paul, I'm surprised how much we get along, because actually my presentation will focus on the effect of the group, in a sense, on the development and eventually the therapy, the treatment of autism. And I will focus on the effect of trauma and transgenerational transmission of trauma in the autism-related disorders. This is a subject, a topic that is going quite popular. For example, I will quote this recently published book in which from the start, in a way, from the use of the DSM-5, we know that under the category of autism spectrum disorders, there is associated the trauma and stressor-related disorders as well, because these conditions are similar. Because children with developmental disorders are particularly vulnerable to traumatic events, and all of them have pervasive effect on the brain and development. So it's not a case that we can try to link this trauma area to autism. We know, and also Bill talked about it a lot, that there is a genetic and epigenetic background for autism. The inheritance of autistic spectrum disorders is increasing in the sense that research is discovering more and more genes involved, up to 100, but is not entirely genetic, but surroundings, ambient, and experience in life, that means epigenetics, has a great effect, as, for example, showed by studies with twins, in which identical twins, one is affected by autism and the other one not. That means that the genetics is absolutely identical, but evidently the influence of the experience after, or even maybe even during the prenatal period, had an effect on the development of the disease. There are also examples suggesting intergenerational or transgenerational transmission of autism, or in this case of acquired phenotypes, because we can define epigenetics as the transmission of phenotypes characteristic, while at the same time the genetics part is completely unchanged. So it's the expression of the genotype that is influenced by external factors or internal factors, maybe. That's my thesis. So there is this, let's say, natural experiment during the Second World War, in which the extreme, the severe famine to which were exposed the pregnant women led to a higher risk for metabolic and mental health disease in the first generation. Interesting enough, only in the first half of the pregnancy, the famine has this effect on the first generation. But even more interesting, also the second generation was affected by the same risk. It was linked mainly to first generation fathers. It means that this increased risk was linked only to the male transmission of the genes. Unfortunately, you may say that the third generation was not affected. That means that a complete epigenetic inheritance stopped at the second generation, not at the third generation, that was the one completely not exposed to the famine, to the effect of the famine. In other species, and enlarging our frame of reference in studying autism is, in my opinion, extremely important. We know, for example, in mammals like the rodents, that epigenetic transmission is working in a very clear way compared to humans. For example, there are these experiments in which it's possible to induce in the mice an enhanced behavioral sensitivity to an odorant, the acetophenone, that leads to an increased number of olfactory sensory neurons that are characteristic for these odorants. And of course, in mice, it's possible to go into details, and the picture here shows the increased number of nerve fibers in even to the second generation, that is F2. So it's demonstrated, at least in, let's say, lower mammals, the possibility of a transgenerational inheritance of behavior, or in this case, of sensitivity to odorants. In this way, there are more and more evidence accumulating for the biological inheritance of acquired epigenetic marks. This taken for granted now. I mean, there is an agreement about the fact that plants, for example, have this kind of epigenetic transmissions, but in humans remain still controversial. But nonetheless, both maternal and paternal inheritance is documented. And I guess in the future, they will be even demonstrated also in humans. Why is this epigenetic way of transmission so important? Because, of course, that means that early life environment has to be taken into the first place in order to prevent the development of disease, not only metabolic, but also regarding mental health and autism. Secondarily, the plasticity that is provided by the epigenomic influence on phenotypes means that therapy, our psychoanalysis or even psychotherapy, could influence and transform the way the brain works and actually is made even later, not only in the early phase of development, but probably also later in life. Apart and beyond the high complex genetic influence on the factors of ASD, we have to take into account, as also Bill said already, the risk factor linked to environment. I will skip the intrauterine, perinatal, postnatal, in the sense the biological ones, but I will focus on the parental acquired risk factors that are chronic trauma, in particular early relational trauma, that is affecting parenting skills, and so the following attachment disorders. To be a little bit more, going more into details, in the autistic brain has been described, overgrowing, especially in the frontal lobes. And very interesting, this is also true at the more cellular level, which, as you can see, the dendritic spines in autism are much more present compared to the typical developmental child. That means that in a way, the brain works in a more complex, probably in a very dysfunctional way, due to also to this overgrowing. We know from studies, especially of Baron Cohen, the empathy could be a measure of how the social brain is impaired, in the sense that is very low in autistic child, while they tend to focus on non-social details and stimuli. For example, Baron Cohen provided this very interesting experiment in which the eye of the baby are longer focused on non-social stimuli, like this ball, multicolored ball, instead of focusing on the face, that means a social stimuli. And this probably is one of the mechanisms why the allostatic overload and the psychological overload of the child is so high, because they cannot actually probably stand for the exchange of gaze with the adults. That means that the social brain is not developing properly. Of course, we have to integrate. That's the new way to work and to cure people with autism. We integrate continuously biological and developmental data. As Bill beautifully already said, I will only to add to what has been already said, that the fact that the associated genes with autistic spectrum disorders converge on processes like neural signaling and development, synaptic transmission, activity-dependent chromatin remodeling. That means all the process, metabolic process that has to do with the growth and transmission, and so communication, even at the neural level. Actually, what is defined evidence-based treatment has to be taken into account also for us as psychoanalysts, in the sense that if the rationale behind any kind of treatment is the plasticity of the infant's brain, of course we have to be able at least to understand, if not actively produce, the kind of procedures that are typical of some evidence-based treatment like the JASPER, that are joint attention, symbolic play, engagement and regulation, or the Denver model, that has the focus of the interpersonal exchange and the shared attention as the core targets. Because this intervention, as also Paul said, has to be applied at an ecological level. That means including always the parents, the teachers, in order to induce changes in parental-teacher synchrony and child initiation, boosting the sensitivity to early communicative tools and encouraging the child efforts to enter into the social worlds. Because, of course, the real risk is a iatrogenic re-traumatization in therapeutic interventions, ignoring the narrow substrate of autistic spectrum disorders. Because if we lose time, the therapeutic windows of proper intervention could be missed. And that's probably a damage, not so easily repairable in the future. So we have to take the opportunities. Because, for example, like this diagram shows quite beautifully, in the autistic spectrum disorders, that is the continuous blue line, there is this 2 to 6 years old, in which there is the huge difference in early brain overgrowth. It has probably to do with this compensation, maladaptive compensation, that has to be changed by early arriving treatment. And so, if there is a relationship with post-traumatic stress disorders, of course, we can find it also in the adults affected by PTSD. Chronic social trauma is one example of this. And of course, the inability to make eye contact or the non-integration of body sensory perception, or even the last point, the dissociation, are something that we find also in autistic children and adults. This to link with the modern theories of emotional and arousal regulation. Of course, the psychoanalyst, as we know, in trauma-related disorders, should replace the missed good internal mother. And as already have been said, the analyst's active body engagement, that also include one of the major tools is the imitation of the infant expressions during the session, is a prerequisite to the effective establishment of interaction. And then, later on, therapeutic relationship. So the analyst focus has to be on body sensation, the co-transference, to foster, I say, interoceptive awareness, heteroregulation, and social competence. As we know from our work with adults, as simple psychoanalysts, I will say, the resilience along the lifespan, as to say, the reversible trauma is based on good enough prenatal and postnatal attachment experience with the caregivers. instead of the damaging absence or chronic mismatch of them and the subsequent impossibility of interactive repair. Internal presence and persistence of a good, comforting, trustable relationship is the goal, actually, of every therapy, with every kind of patient, actually. But this is especially true, I think, for autistic children. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francesco. You offer a lot of ideas for the discussion later, and also about the re-traumatization of the patients. So thank you very much. We'll go very quickly to Iris, because if not, we will be late. Iris, are you ready to share your slides?
So I want to express my gratitude, as Bill said, to the invitation, to this lovely invitation, to this meeting. And it is, Rosa, it is a very challenging case, and you're very courageous bringing up this case. And I will need some courage as well to speak up whatever I want to say. So I will do it because, you know, this is neuropsychoanalysis. Being the founder member and of the society, of the International Society, and the founder and chairperson of the Israeli Society, this is what I have to do, so I'll do that. I call this presentation When the Inner World Becomes the Outer World, or the entire world, I'd say. And I'll tell you what I'm going to do in a minute, but first I have to express another gratitude to this beautiful group who is dealing in Israel for the last 10 years with selective mutism. They are researching selective mutism in the Schneider Children's Hospital. And Marianne Sorel was very nice to share with me the information of that group. I want to thank Dina Glatt, who is here with us, who also helped me to and was contributing information, as well as Hannah Strom-Cohen. And special thanks to Professor Mark Soames, who was very interested in what we were doing and has given another contribution. And I will try to give you this angle of neuropsychoanalysis. And I will start with describing the emotional systems. I've done the whole emotional system, but I will just deal with the two emotional systems we are now going to speak about in this case. But just let me read this for you. Language is situated between the cry and the silence. Silence often makes heard the cry of psychic pain. And behind the cry, the call of silence is like comfort. Each silence is a compromise formation concealing the unconscious fantasy from which it originates, while expressing a conscious one. I would love to have you here with what also to introduce Wittgenstein, which is speaking about the limits of my language, which means the limits of my world. And from here we'll go, just keep it in mind while I'm speaking, the emotional systems, which we are going to use in here. One of them, which is very important, is what you can see in this picture, which is separation anxiety, which results in panic grief. So when kids get lost, they feel separation anxiety, they cry when they need care, and they feel lonely on the verge of panic. This kind of turning to the world reflects a pain of all generations encoded in the brain and is the resource of older, mature pain and the way in which sorrow is created. Separation anxiety, which appears in babies, broadly speaking around 8 months, which is found in mammals and even birds, indicating intergeneration inheritance. The brain's chemicals, which serve to feel deserted, corticotropin releasing factor, and what makes it alleviates the suffering, opioid, oxytocin, and prolactin, indicate the social attachment, the same as lust and care. They are able to ease the pain of depression. This chemistry creates the social subjective interrelationship spaces which allow the organism to learn models of managing emotional relationships with love and empathy. The other emotional system which we will need to relate to is rage, which is provoked each time there is a competition over resources. This system can wake up by restriction, frustration, and everything which irritates. When the organism does not receive what it wants. Like every subcortical system, the higher cortical parts can create inhibition, direction, and other ways of emotional regulation. Adults regulate emotions better than children. People with frontal damage will be less effective in regulation. Let me go in some details to those, not too many details, to the diagnosis and differential diagnosis of people with patients with selective mutism. I will just read to you that. Current findings suggest that selective mutism is liable to be more frequent than what was previously thought. Previously believed, with the prevalence of the reaches 0.7 to 0.8 in child population. This is only slightly lower than other childhood psychiatric disorders, like, for example, obsessive compulsive disorders. And the comorbidity goes with selective mutism to be strongly linked with generalized anxiety disorder or social phobia, or sometimes selective mutism is going with ASD, as was described in here before. Concerning the above, BX does not suffer from social phobia, from general anxiety disorder. She meets the people around her with an inquisitive and even stimulating look. At age 11, she was able to play with all kids. I think, to be correct, it was stated 13. BX received different diagnoses as to whether she is psychotic or autistic. I didn't find any evidence either for her autism nor for her psychosis. Though listening to Bill, I found out that some of what he was saying is resonating with what is appearing here. But I would rather say I wouldn't see no psychosis, that's for sure. With this in mind, I will present neuropsychoanalytic understanding of her case based on the several emotional systems. This is how we would work in neuropsychoanalytic approach. As we grow up during childhood, our relations with our parents, family, and family members, and our culture create structures in our brain. These structures are built into our memory systems. Those structures are implicit, appearing in non-declarative memory systems. The psyche aspires to homeostasis. We like and we love our comfort zone, but the world is full of surprises and therefore of free energy. Those systems are solid, created in the past, and predict the future. What is central? We are looking for what is the central emotional system, and what is therefore what will be the false prediction. I will explain a bit. The false prediction is happening. It is an implicit prediction. This is the predictions that comes out from our attachment relationships. We are looking to satisfy our needs. When we have satisfied our needs in a certain way, then we have a prediction. This prediction is usually implicit and it is acted in the world. So the only way to get to understand this kind of prediction is by letting people analyze what is the prediction. I will go then to a bit short way looking at the development background that we were given by Rosa. We are told that until the age 3, BX developed well, normal birth, normal movement, speech and linguistic development. At the age of 3, the parents noticed that BX, oh, sorry, it is J, but this is, bear with me. BX doesn't talk to anyone other than the small number of people in her immediate surroundings. In effect, this situation continued until BX reached the age of 40, at which point she returned to therapy for the second time. The outcome of the work done, as research works also show, didn't help to improve the quality of the patient's life, nor did it lead to a better understanding of her life. This is manifested in the fact that the patient returns to therapy, the same therapy she had, a helpful therapy that at the time gave some rise to the hope of change. So I'll say some words about that psychoanalytic therapy. Jay had had psychoanalytic treatment 3 or 4 times a week, and with a second young therapist, Rosa, who worked in a manner more akin to CBT, allowing herself to be a transitional object, creating intermediate space for BX. BX, as we were told, remained silent for 4 years, facing the wall, whilst therapists waited for BX to talk to her during the psychoanalytic treatment. To say the least, it was a treatment that did not lead to any progress, despite the success and gratitude accorded to the therapist by the family, who even gifted her clock, alluding perhaps to the way in which time had passed slowly without any therapeutic achievements. The question remains as to why that therapy continued for so long. An additional question is, what in fact the family was saying thank you for? Was it for keeping the child in a pattern of silence? Are the family also unable to stand their ground and ask questions? Did the family leave the child as an index patient out of family convenience, out of a lack of awareness of the role she played in the present family? Or maybe there were other possibilities. I want to say something about the possible benefits of psychoanalytic treatment. Maybe the first therapist who did not demand that BX make any changes had made herself a safe place for BX. Maybe the analyst who was sitting there quietly, allowing her to speak, not to speak, was someone who she could predict and did not scare her. Maybe the parents appreciated the patience the analyst had to stay calm and undemanding of their child. And they were calm as well because the child was in therapy, allowing the time to fly in a different rhythm than usual, accepting BX and finally ending treatment when BX is 11 and playing, or 13, playing with her friends. So how would we think of J in a neuropsychoanalytic perspective? Which are the main emotional systems and what are the false predictions? So BX is in a state of panic. Her mutism is clearly a protest behavior, and therefore the emotional system is panic grief. It is increasingly that early on, this state turns into rage. Her panic is caused by the unpredictability of other human beings beyond the familiar family circle where she is able to make predictions. In the end, the parents choose out of their free will to take an early retirement and to accompany their child woman to therapy sessions. They too were calm and accepting of the misfortune of having grown up grumpy woman who needs to stay with herself. So the second therapist. The parallel additional therapy, who is Rosa, was very helpful. In this parallel therapy, the therapist helped the child to discover the experience of being me, of being a thinker, a child who could choose who to talk to in the family and who not to talk to. The grandfather. She wouldn't talk to the grandfather. A child who lacked spontaneous speech in social situations, but not in family constellation. From time to time, for the sake of updating of accuracy, what has been said privately, she whispers what she has to say to a therapist so that she can broadcast BX words. By broadcasting, she is becoming the mediator, and Rosa is being inaccurate on purpose in order to slowly expose BX to the differences, to allow her an opportunity to have a voice. Her spontaneity seems to appear when she rejects talking to her grandfather within the family. However, in light of the family's history, this matter can be registered as an inability to talk with what the grandfather signifies. The traumatic experiences he endured during Holocaust, which the family doesn't want to be involved in. Yet, by her symptom, Jay shows that implicitly she knows that the world can become unpredictable at once, as happened with the grandfather family. It would appear that she is capable of thinking, has an appropriate cognitive ability. She creates interaction with a provocative and communicative look, which reduces the likelihood of autism. She distinguishes between what is accurate and what is not accurate. That is to say, she is intelligent, and it would appear that she has no thought disorders, no hallucination are mentioned, no delusions, and not even deterioration of her intelligence when she is 40. Therefore, no psychosis whatsoever. She is capable of talking in whispers and to correct a therapist, but she is unable to speak in a regular voice with strangers, friends, and adults outside the family circle. It is apparent that she is interested in communication, but feel inside herself a prohibition against it, or in other words, a deep panic. She severely restricts an interaction with the frightening, unpredictable outside world. Let's talk about the dynamic perspective and this false prediction. From a dynamic point of view, it would seem that the close bonds with her mother and father left no transitional space in which she could form from a changing, repetitive distance where she could feel separate on one hand and herself on the other. The dominant figure between mother and father was the mother. BX does not allow herself to have any autonomous self. Instead, her strategy is a narcissistic one, which restricts her interaction with the world in order to feel safe. This will inevitably be a failure. The mother was a figure of identification. She is identifying with her mother in a sort of a Kleinian projective identification way in order to prevent panic. And she has rage to the not me mother world. It seems that she is kind of a beautiful doll. The mother's complaint is that she is a doll without a clear identity of her own, a doll full of panic, a child so fearful that when the need to speak arises, she reacts with rage at all levels. A child that is unable to open up to the world, not that she doesn't yearn to do so. According to the look in her eyes, there was an interest and involvement in certain years when she was still young, and her caregiver was around and introduced her to new environments and places. This possibility of turning to the world is undoubtedly suffused with the help of a therapist who has become a mediator, a creator of transitional space. When the therapist disappears, the only thing the child is left with is avoidance. It is not entirely clear why the therapy came to a close. It turns out that it ended when BX was 11 years old and mingling with friends at school and behaving freely there. The treatment by her analyst ceased at the time when she had not yet sounded a single word.
Iris, I'm sorry to disturb you, but you have only 2 minutes left. I don't know if you want to conclude or unfortunately it's too long.
I would like to say, I will need another 5 minutes.
Yeah. Okay, not more, because we cannot cut the discussion with the audience. I'm really sorry. It's very interesting, but it's really impossible.
Yeah. All right. So
Okay.
I'll
Try to conclude so
Yeah,
that you give the sense of the second part. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, in a minute I'll decide what I will run forward. So let me just make it clear. The assumption is that what is the false prediction the child this woman is holding inside? The assumption is that if I am close to my mother and father, and really, really close, I will be protected from that world which moved without any control, a world which is full of changes. I will avoid all anxieties when I'm there, but her behavior on the world stage avoids contacts that are liable to create some sort of separate space of her own. And she is filled with rage at the world, the not me mother, which appears. She splits her mother in a kind of narcissistic way. I will not go to this citation, but I will go further. I think this could be very helpful. What happens 30 years later. And this will take me another 2 minutes, okay? Okay, Claudia? All right then. 30 years later, the entire family joyfully come to meet Rosa. Though it can be pain, I want to say something which maybe give some light to what Rosa was saying in the intermission. Though it can be very painful to encounter children with developmental problems in their childhood, the pain is still bearable. But in adulthood, however, such an encounter is a cruel phenomenon, even for therapists. Perhaps this fact clarifies why a return to therapy consists of only one meeting a week, with the therapist who, despite her devotion, sounds like someone who doesn't like her patient. When she was young, she was fun. The patient who previously had hope despite their disability will now have to deal with the lost years in adulthood. To see a patient who has made no headway since childhood, still stuck in the same old pictures and locations that keep on recurring in a compulsive manner, is to see the pain and the cruelty of the psychic disability that has remained embedded in that patient. So our dear Rosa is doing exactly that wonderful thing, this work, wonderful work. She lends herself as a transitional object. She widens the girl's predictive capacities. It means that now that emotions are rising, she is helping her to bound the free energy of her feelings in order to accept that the world is moving and is there for her to become herself. Second, she introduced the differences between the now and then and between herself and BX. This is where interpretation could go in a neuropsychoanalytic psychotherapy. Thank you very much.